Okay, hello everyone. Okay, so the first program in chapter 6 is the employee class. Okay, so that's a long one. All right, so write a class named employee that has the following fields. A name field. The name field references a string object that holds the employee's name. The ID number. The ID number is an int variable that holds the employee's ID number. Department. The department field references a string object that holds the name of the department where the employee works. Position. The position field references a string object that holds the employee's job title. Now, a class should have the following constructors. A constructor that accepts the following values as argument and assigns them to the appropriate fields. So it's going to accept the employee's name, employee's ID number, department and then position. A constructor that accepts the following values as arguments and assigns them to the appropriate fields. So a constructor that takes the employee's name, employee's ID number, and it says over here, let me just close this here. It says that the department and position fields should be assigned an empty string. A no-arg constructor that assigns empty strings to the name, department, and position fields, and 0 to the ID number field. Write appropriate mutator methods that store values in these fields and accessor methods that return the values in these fields. Once you have written the class, write a separate program that creates 3 employee objects to hold the following data. Okay, that creates 3 employee objects to hold the following data. Okay, so basically, once you're done, you should basically have something like this displayed. The program should store this data in the 3 objects and then display the data for each employee on the screen. Okay, so let's start. Well, first of all, we need to go ahead and create the class. We need to go ahead and create the employee class. So I'm going to create that in its own file. And so let's do that. What I'll do is I'll make a copy of this once I create the program also in main. The program that's going to test the class. But this is going to be the class, okay? So to create the class, I'm going to start with the keyword public class. And the class it's basically an employee class. I'll call it employee. And we need to go ahead and define the fields for this class. The fields for this class, right? So let's see. So over here it says, write a class named employee that has the following fields. So the first field we have is a name. And it tells us that the name field references a string object that holds the employee's name. So it's just going to be a regular variable in this class. So it said that it's a string. It references a string object that holds the employee's name. So it's going to be a private variable. Okay, it's going to be a private field because we don't want code outside this class. Okay, code that doesn't belong to this class to access this variable. We don't want code outside this class to access this variable and be able to make changes to it or even do anything to it. We want to hide it from any code outside this class and only make this variable available to what's in this class, right? So that's why we're setting it as private variables. So I'm going to set it as private. So it's going to be a string. So private string name. That's the first field. The second field is going to be the ID number. The ID number is an int variable that holds the employee's ID number. So again, we are making all the fields private because we want to hide it, data hidden. So private int ID number. The next is the department. The department field references a string object that holds the name of the department where the employee works. So it's going to be a string, private string department. And we have the position. So the position field references a string object that holds the employee's job title. So it's also going to be a private field. It references a string. So this variable over here. So the position field, this field department references a string. It's basically a string variable, a string object. You can think of it like that. Even though although it's a variable, it's a class type variable. It's not a primitive variable. So it references this a string object. Okay, but it's pretty much a variable. So that's going to hold the employee's job title. So let's put a semicolon here. Now let's move to the constructors. It's over here. It says the class should have the following constructors: a constructor that accepts the following values as argument and assigns them to the appropriate fields. So we have to create a constructor that's going to accept the employer's name, employer's ID, department, and position. Okay. Now the constructor is basically the method that's going to be called when we create an instance of this class. So it's the method that's going to be called when we create an object from this class. So we can create multiple constructors, giving them different parameters. But the first constructor, it wants us to, the question wants us to create a constructor that's going to accept the name, employee's ID number, department, and position. Okay, so it's going to accept it as arguments. So to create a constructor, we start with a keyword public. We want to make it public, okay, to code outside of class, not private. We want to make the constructor public so that code outside this class can be able to access this constructor to instantiate an object, or to instantiate the fields in an object, to instantiate these fields. Okay, so the constructor doesn't have any return type. We don't add the keyword static. It doesn't have a return type because we don't call this method on purpose. We don't, it's called automatically, and we are not the ones who call it. We are not specific about calling it. Like we don't call it in an explicit manner. It's called automatically. It's not called by us. So because of that, it can't return anything. So that's why we don't. It doesn't have a return type. So we just say public employee, and the constructor has to have the same name as the class. That's why we're calling it employee here. So the program said the constructor should accept. The first constructor should accept employee's name, employee's ID number, department and then position. So the first field is going to accept, or the first argument is going to accept, is going to be the employee's name. So I'll just say employee's name and employee name. But first of all, it's going to be a string. That's what we're supposed to specify. So it's going to take the employee's name. It's going to take the employee's ID number, which is going to be an int employee ID number. It's going to also take the department, which is going to be a string. So string department. Let's just give it different. Let's just give it different names, since we're going to store it here. It's still going to work, but I just want to give it different names so that it's not confusing, right? So first of all, let me just finish creating the structure here. Okay, so it's going to accept employee name, employee ID number. Let's just say employee department, just so we change the name. So employee department, and then the last field is argument is going to accept as a position. So we're going to say employee position. So the constructor is going to initialize the field. So basically, you're going to initialize these fields with these values given. So we want to go ahead and set the name field to be equal to what was given to us for the name field, which is the employee name. We want to set the ID number. Anytime we create an object from this class, these fields are going to be instantiated with the values given over here by the user who was trying to create an object from this class. So these values are going to be instantiated, these fields are going to be instantiated with these values. So ID number, okay, this ID number is going to be equal to the value that was given to replace ID number, which is employee ID number. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. And department is going to be equal to what was given for department, which is employee department. And then the last one is, oops, I named this twice. I don't know why I did that. This is supposed to be position. Position, did I do that? Let's see. ID number is an int. Position is a string. Okay, so string position. I don't know why I did department. I'm sure some of you caught it, or if not all of you. All right, so position is going to be instantiated with the value that was given to the user, given by the user, which is employee position here. Okay, so now this constructor will accept for argument, and it's going to instantiate the fields of this class. So basically, whatever object is created from this class is going to have these fields, but then instantiated with or initialized with these values. Okay, so by default, when an object is created, the fields of that object are going to have these values. So this is one constructor. It wants us to create multiple constructors. The second constructor over here, it says a constructor that accepts the following values as arguments and assigns them to the appropriate field. So it's going to accept the employee's name and ID number. The department and position field should be assigned an empty string. Let's go ahead and create another constructor. It's pretty much going to take this format. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it. It's going to have the same name as the class. The constructor always has the same name as the class. Employee, no return type, and then no static keyword added to it. Yes. Okay, so it's just going to be public and employee, and it's going to be the method that's called. Okay, so basically, whatever constructor you call. So for example, if you call a constructor and you pass in for argument, it's going to use this constructor. The second constructor wants us to pass in 2 arguments. We'll change it. So if in main, if you try to create an object from this class passing in 2 arguments, then it's going to use this constructor. But let's finish creating this constructor, and then we can move on from there. So this second constructor accepts the following values: the employee's name and ID number. So it's going to accept the employee's name and ID number. That's it. It's not going to accept anything else. But it says that over here, it says the department and position field should be assigned an empty string. So meaning that the name is going to be assigned the employee name, all right. The ID number is going to be assigned the employee ID number. But then it says the department over here, the department and position fields should be assigned an empty string. So for the departments and position fields, we're going to initialize them to empty strings. And it tells us that we should use 2 double quotes for that. Okay. So for the department and the position, we're assigning that to an empty string. So if someone calls or tries to create an object from this class passing in 2 arguments, then the program is going to use this constructor to instantiate or initialize these fields. It's going to set name to whatever name was given by the user. It's going to set ID number to whatever ID number was given by the user. It's going to set the department and position to empty strings. So these are the default values that the fields of that particular object is going to have. Okay, the fields of that particular object that was created from this class is going to have. Now it wants us to go ahead and create a third constructor. Now it says a no arg constructor, which means a no argument constructor, a constructor that takes no argument, but it assigns empty strings to the name, department, and position fields, and 0 to the ID number field. So it's yet again another constructor. Again, it's going to be similar to this one: public, the name of the class, public employee, no return type, because we didn't call it in an explicit manner, so it can't return any value. So no return type, and then no static keyword. It's just public employee, the name of the class. Now this constructor is going to be a no arg constructor. Okay, no argument constructor. So it accepts no arguments. So it's not going to accept any argument, but the program wants us to assign empty strings to the name. So let's assign empty strings to the name, to the department. Oops, that's ID number. Sorry. To the department, we already have an empty string, and position fields. Position also has an empty string because they're all strings, and 0 to the ID number field. So ID number now is going to have 0. And we know because it's a number, no strings are around it. If we do this, then we've basically assigned it to the string 0. So let's go ahead and do this. All right. So now we're done with the constructors. We're done with it. Now it says write appropriate mutator methods that store values in these fields and accessor methods that return the values in these fields. So let's start with the mutator methods. The methods that set because we've made these fields private, no code outside this class can change or even access these fields. Only code inside this class can change or access these fields. So in order to make code outside this class have access to these fields, we are going to go ahead and create methods. We're going to create public methods that code outside this class can use to access these fields. Okay, so now these are the constructors. Now I like to have my constructors, last. I'll first have the fields, the mutator and access, the mutators and accessors, and then the constructors. So I'm going to go ahead and start the mutators and accessors here in the middle. So the first mutator, which is the first setter, okay, either mutators or setters. The first method that I'm going to create to set some of the fields, some of these fields, is basically a setter or a mutator for the name, right? So it's going to be a method. It's going to be a method. So I'm going to go ahead and create a public. I want to make it public because I want code outside this class to be able to use this method to be able to set the name of this field. Okay, so I'm going to create a public. Again, it doesn't. So let me just finish typing it and I'll explain. So I'm going to create a public, not static. I'll explain why. Public method. It's not going to return anything because all it's doing is setting the name. So I'm going to create a public void method. I'm going to call it set name. Okay, it's not going to accept any argument. All it's doing is it's going to accept argument. I'm sorry, because we want to go ahead and set the name with something, right? So it's going to accept an argument. I'm sorry, I was thinking about get name. Okay, actually get name is going to return something, so we're supposed to return a type. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, it's going to return nothing, but it's going to accept an argument. It's going to accept an argument from whoever is calling this method. So public void set name, we have to provide the name. So I'm going to specify a parameter for that. Whoever is calling this method has to provide a name or an argument for this method. So public void set name, we need the name, right? So I'm going to specify a variable. Because set name is a string, we need a string for that. So I'm going to specify a string parameter called, name given. I don't want it to be the same as a field, although it will work. But I'm going to set the name to the name field to the name given here. So all I'm going to do is set the name field to the name given. Okay. All right. So once we've done that, so basically this method is the setter for the name field. We're going to create multiple ones for these 4 fields as well. So let's go ahead and set those ones. But so set name is going to do that. Now let's create another one for set ID number. So public void is not going to return anything, but we're going to call it set ID number. ID number is going to accept an argument, which is going to be the ID number given. And we're basically changing the ID number field to the ID number given, right? But think about it. When someone wants to set the ID number of a field of a particular object, right? Over here, it's accepting a string, right? Let's see. Ultimately, I was supposed to accept an integer because guess what? ID number is so let me not confuse you. I'll come back to this later. Let me just change this. Okay, let me change this. I'm going to copy it, and then let me just change this to public void set ID number. But I want to take an int because when you think about it, ID number is an int, right? So we need to set it with an integer. So let's go ahead and create a public void set ID number, right? And then allow the user to type in an argument, which is an integer, and we are setting the ID number to that integer that was given because ID number is an integer. If you think about it, if you try to accept a string and you try to store a string in an integer variable, it's going to complain. But we want to make the program flexible, right? We want to make the program flexible just so that when someone is using the G option pane, they don't have to convert whatever the user typed into an integer before putting it here. They can just go ahead and put in a string. We want to make the program flexible so that when we call the set ID number, the user can type in a string and it'll still work. All we have to do is just do the conversion in the class. So I'm going to create the same constructor for the set ID number. They can have the same name but different data types. This time I'm going to set it to a string, so that when the user calls the set ID number, they can still pass in a string, although ID number is an integer. But guess what? This is going to be a string being stored in an integer variable. That's an error. So we need to go ahead and convert whatever was given, or the ID number given, to an integer. Actually, not double. We need to go ahead and convert it to an integer. Okay, so we're going to use one of the methods in Java's wrapper classes, which is integer.parseInt, and we are converting this. We are passing this number into an integer. Basically, we are passing this value here to an integer and storing it here. So basically, we've made the program very flexible. We've created two constructors just for set ID number. It's not going to be a problem because they have different data types. The first one, different parameter types. The first one is accepting an integer. That's no problem. It can go ahead and store an integer in the ID number field because because ID number is an integer. Okay, it can store an integer in the ID number field because ID number is an integer. The second set ID number mutator or setter is going to accept a string. Now it's going to try to put a string in an integer. Okay, that's going to give you an error. So we have to go ahead and convert that string into an integer. Okay, before putting it in an integer. So we are making the program flexible. The user can put in a number or they can put in a string, and it's still going to set the ID number, with an integer. So that's that. The program didn't mention it, but that's good practice, and that's something you should do all the time, just to make your program flexible. Okay, so now the next setter or the next mutator we have to set is, we have to create is a setter or a mutator for the department, right? So it's going to take the same format. So let's go ahead and copy it. Copy this one, and then I'll say set department. And set department is going to take a string. Now we know it's a string, so let's just accept a string department given, a string parameter called department given, and we are changing the department field to the department given, the department given variable, or the department given argument. Now the last one is going to be the position. So it's going to return nothing. All these are returning nothing, but the accepting arguments for the position, we are accepting a value as an argument, which is going to be the position given, and we are setting the position field to the position given. Okay, so now we're done with the mutators, right? The setters. So now over here. It also says that write appropriate mutator methods. We've done that. That store the values in these fields. And over here it says and accessor methods that return the values in these fields. So now we're done with the mutators. Now we need to go ahead and create the accessors or the getters. Okay, so now let's start those here. So it's also going to be a method. All it's going to do is it's going to return the value stored in these fields, the fields of a particular object, right? Because over here it says and accessor methods that return the values in these fields. So let's start with trying to return the value in name, or trying to get the value of name. So let's create a public method. Again, no static because it's no static because if you have a method, okay, that is working on the field of a particular object of a class, okay, then that method is an instance method. And with instance methods, you don't add the keyword static to it. Once we get to chapter 8, it will explain more of that. Actually, I think chapter 8 or one of the chapters, it will explain more of that. But for now, just know that anytime you have a method, okay, Well, first of all, these are instance fields, and these are instance methods. Instance methods are methods that directly change or basically operate on. If it's a method that is basically working on a particular instance of a class, then it's an instance method. With instance methods, you don't add the keyword static to it. Okay, they can have return types, but then no static keyword. Okay, and like I said, just know that instance methods don't have the keyword static. Once we get to the future chapters, it will be clear more. Okay, we'll explain. I'll explain more, and it will be clear. But for now, just know that instance methods don't have the keyword static. Again, instance methods are methods that work on a particular object of a class. Okay, and we don't add the keyword static to it. So we're going to create another instance methods, but this time instance method. This time accesses. This time the getters. Right. Let's create one for the name field. We want to get the value of it. It's going to return basically what's stored in name. Okay, name is a string. So let's set the return type of this method to a string. So public string. Let's call this get name. Get name is not going to accept any argument. All right, it's not going to accept any argument, and all it's going to do is return what is stored in main. It's returning what is stored in name. It's returning a string, so we know name is a string. So all we want to do is return what is stored in name. That's it. Okay, we set a return type, the name of the method, and it's returning what is stored in name. Now we are defining these public methods so that code outside this class won't be able to directly change the values of these or even see what's in here. To see or change it, they will have to use the accesses and mutators. To change the values of these fields, they would have to use the setters or the mutators. To get the values of these fields, they would have to use the getters or the accessors. Okay, so now we've created the public string get name. Okay, the getter for the name field. We're going to do the same thing for the other ones. Oops. So let's create a getter for the ID number field. Now it's going to return an integer because we know the ID number is an int, and what we want to do is return the ID number because the ID number is an integer. Do the same thing for department. We are getting it's going to return a string for the department. So we set a return type, call it, I'm supposed to change the name for this one to get ID number. For the third one, we are getting the department. So let's get the department. Let's change the name to get department. And return the department field, just to know what's in there. And the next getter we are setting is for the position. So the position is returning a string, and we're going to call it get position. Here, and we are returning the position. Okay, so now we're done with the class. We have our fields, we have our mutators or our setters, and then we have our getters or our accessors. We have our constructors here, which is basically, depending on which one we call, is going to instantiate. Actually, all of them are going to instantiate the field of a particular object, but then depending on which one you choose, or depending on how you try to create an object, one of these are going to be selected, and then how your fields are instantiated are going to be different based on these constructors. Okay, so now we have this class. So now all we have to do is just go ahead and use it. Okay, so let's go ahead and first of all, let's try to compile this. We'll just make sure we don't have any errors. So let's go to programming challenges in chapter 5. Okay, Actually, this is chapter 6, so let's go to program challenges and create a new folder for chapter 6 and save this as employee.java. Okay. We have a couple of errors, so let's see. Identify expected. Okay, I didn't specify the type of this. Employee position is, for the constructor, it's going to be a string. It's going to first of all need an argument, and I didn't specify the type of it. It's supposed to be a string for employee position. Position is a string, yes. So I've put it there. Let's compile it again. More problems. Okay, so cannot find symbol variable department. How did I call this? I call this department. So that's why I couldn't see it. I'm trying to set the department field, which I have called departments here. So it doesn't know what this department is. So I need to put a T here. And again, I'm sure some of you saw it, or all of you saw it, and I didn't see it. So let me compile this again. And more errors. Okay, so set ID number int is already defined in employee. Okay, so let's see. Get name, get set ID number, set ID. Okay, I forgot to change this to set position because I already have set ID number here. It's true. So it's seeing this and this as the same. It's seeing the signature as the same name, same parameter types. I meant to remember we were dealing with ID number, the two ID numbers, the two different constructors for different setters for the ID number, department, name and position. I have the name here. Oops, I have the name here, but I'm missing the position. So this is supposed to be set position. And I'm taking the position given and putting it in the position field. So let's compile this. All right, more problems. Or incompatible types found int required. Okay, string. Okay, so set position. Okay, so position. I thought it's an int, so I set the type to an int. It's a string. So we need to set the. First of all, let me explain. It's trying to put an int into a string, so it's going to try to complain. That's why it said that incompatible types. It found an int. It needs a string because this variable is a string. So it's trying to it found int here. It needs a string. It requires a string to put in a string. So I need to change this to a string. Again, I'm sure you all saw it, and I don't know. I guess I was speeding through it, so I didn't see it. So let me compile this, and then now the class is fine. It's fine.